My name is Gabe Sachter Smith. I'm a banana farmer and enthusiast growing on the North Shore of Oahu. Thanks for being here. Next. Okay, so I started studying bananas in 2004 when I was about 13 years old in Colorado. I just got really interested in them and wanted to learn about them, so I started growing them in a very cold climate, not unlike Hokkaido. We have a lot of similarities there. I ended up doing my undergrad and master's at Manoa, studying bananas and tropical ag. And there's me in high school doing some science fair stuff, growing bananas with snow outside. And now I maintain a 35-acre certified organic banana farm. I maintain about 150 varieties. And in my spare time, which is increasingly rare, I do consulting and travel-based diversity studies. Next. So we're going to talk about banana diversity first, and then how that relates to breeding. So they're native to Asia primarily, but also a little bit in Africa and the Pacific. There's 3 genera, Musa, Musella, and Enseti, with around 100 species. They're pretty closely related to gingers and heliconias and bird of paradise. Next. Enseti is a genus with about 8 species. They're native to Asia and Africa. They only flower once and then completely die, unlike true bananas, which will make suckers and flower again. Enseti ventricosum is actually domesticated as a food crop in Ethiopia. Next. This is Superbum. This was actually growing on the left at the Botanic Garden here in Hilo a number of years ago. I think they're dead now, but they're really impressive, cool plants. They can also lend themselves to pot culture. That one is growing in Washington, D.C. at the National Botanic Gardens and is only about 3 feet tall with the same species. Okay, next. Enseti glaucum is native all throughout Southeast Asia. It actually makes pink fleshed fruits that taste kind of like Smarties candies. Have you ever had that? It's pretty interesting. It's also used medicinally. Yeah, really big seeds in the fruit, but still eaten. All right, next. Like I said, Enseti flower once, then completely die, and so they're normally propagated just from seed. Next, please. I'm going to try to get through this quick so that we can get at that fruit. Musella is a...
They turn in their evaluation form.
Okay, turn in your form, please. Musella, there's only 1 species. It's native to China and Vietnam. It was thought to be actually extinct in the wild, but a few years ago some new populations were found. They're really closely related to Enseti. Even though they are pretty much extinct in the wild, they're maintained in cultivation for animal feed and also in some Buddhist temples as a sort of special plant in some traditions, especially in Tibet. Next, please. No, in China, actually, they've started breeding them as sort of a, I don't know what to quite call it. It's like a cut flower, except you dig out the whole plant and you can just re-shove it in a pot and it'll continue to bloom for about a year to a year and a half. So these are what they look like. Those kind of more red forms are from a recently discovered population in Sichuan, actually. So relatively far north in China. They're really, really cold hardy, and they're actually deciduous and almost like a succulent. Next. So Musa, this is the genus that most bananas come from, the ones that we're familiar with. There's around 80 species, native all throughout Southeast Asia, and there's 2 main sections of them, Musa and Kali Musa. Next. So section Musa includes the majority of edible bananas, with around 40 species recognized, and this is wild species, not cultivar, so I'm talking about these wild plants that are just existing out in nature. It was formerly split into 2 separate sections, Eumusa and Rhodoclimes, but now they're combined together. Musa velutina here, which is invasive out of Kaka Falls, you may recognize, is a classic member of this section. Next, please. So a little bit just about banana morphology to kind of understand how these plants work. They're not trees. That's the number one important thing to remember, to know about them. And then that the fruit bunch comes out first, and there's only female flowers. And then after the fruit's set, then it'll make the male flowers. In wild bananas, bats, or typically birds, would be pollinating them, and they're separated in time. So wild bananas don't typically self-pollinate, and edible bananas don't pollinate at all. But if you want to, you can force them to make some seed. Next. Okay, so Musa cuminata, this is the primary ancestral species to almost all edible bananas. There's a number of different subspecies and populations that are involved. There's a few here that you can see. Next. One of the most important is subspecies Banksii. This is from Papua New Guinea. Oh, and by the way, all the photos in this presentation are ones that I've taken around the world. So it's also partly sort of a tour of just bananas I've seen. And I promise you won't be tested. You don't have to take notes on anything. But just trying to show you some fun, interesting things about bananas you may not know. So they're native to Papua New Guinea, maybe a little bit in eastern Indonesia. There's a population in Samoa, which is kind of confusing how it got there. But they make really big fruit, really big bunches, but they're still just a wild plant. Next. Subspecies malacensis is from Peninsular Malaysia. This is also one of the most important ones that contribute to edible bananas. Next. And then Burmanica, which is from India, China, Myanmar, basically Indochina, is also contributed. So what's interesting about this is from 3 very different regions, and the way that they all got together was by people. So it's thought that they probably originated in Papua New Guinea first, and then were carried throughout Southeast Asia across and were brought back. And so bananas, you can actually trace the history of not only the movement of the varieties, but also the movement of people using banana genetics. Next. Okay, the other primary species is Balbisiana. It's actually also naturalized in Hawaii in many areas and really commonly used for almost every non-fruit use. There's a lot of different forms of it. It's actually extremely rare in the wild. Next. But there are semi-domesticated forms. So it's interesting in that they're very domesticated plants. They have large fruit. They have relatively less seeds and a lot of pulp. Actually, the seeds that they make are soft and they don't fully develop, and you can still eat the fruit. So it's sort of a little bit of a strange domesticated banana. And some people call it culti-wild, so they're sort of wild, they're sort of cultivated. This is at a medicine shop in Vietnam. I heard about wild bananas being used medicinally in Vietnam, and I thought it was sort of like a fringe thing you might see, but I was kind of surprised that in every little village in northern Vietnam, there's a medicine shop, and at every single medicine shop, it looked like this: piles of Balbisiana and other wild bananas sitting outside. And every single restaurant and every single person's home would offer you tea or tincture, which is just really strong alcohol with wild banana seeds inside. So a very important part of the culture there. What? What is it used to treat? No clue. Just vitality, probably. General well-being. That's what I was told. Next. Okay, so the move from wild to edible is really complicated. This diagram was produced in the 1960s, and what's amazing about it is actually how accurate it was just by looking at the plants. This is from people just saying, I don't know, like, look at that one, we're trying to figure it out. The reality is way more complicated, but it actually ended up being a pretty good starting point. The main point you got to take from this, though, is that wild acuminata were selected for parthenocarpy first. Don't need it, but thank you. But you can buy one over there. Selection of parthenocarpy was the very first thing. So parthenocarpy means virgin fruit, fruit that forms without the need for pollination. After that, then sterility was selected on top of it. So actually, it's a little bit complicated to understand, but we'll get into it later. But parthenocarpy and sterility are totally separated, and they're both really important for bananas. Next. Okay, so acuminata subspecies Banksii. This, like I mentioned before, is one of the primary ancestral populations, and actually was really excited to find in that weird population in Samoa, which we don't know why it's there, but we found a parthenocarpic wild specimen. So as you can see on the top, we cut open the fruit. There's maybe 1 or 2 seeds, lots of pulp. This would be like the very, very first edible domesticated banana. You could imagine finding this in the forest maybe 5,000, 10,000 years ago, and someone would say, hey, that's kind of nice. Maybe I'll bring it back to the village. And that was essentially the very first act of banana domestication. Next. This is another kind of comparison. I used fei, which are a different weird group of edible bananas I'll talk about a little bit later. but you can see just the difference between an edible parthenocarpic domesticated seedless form on the left and its wild ancestor. So wild bananas are very, very different than the edible ones. There's really not much going on there culinarily, but they're still really useful in breeding. Next. And here's just another example, too, of a more typical type of seeded versus domesticated edible variety. Next. Okay, so we're going to talk about genome groups. Bananas are split into different genetic groups based on their ploidy, which is the number of sets of chromosomes, and then the different relative contribution of the species. So you might see in banana literature this AA, AAA, quadruple A, ABB, all these things. All that means is basically what parents they had or what grandparents they had and which species those came from. That system worked pretty good, but like I said, with modern advancements in technology, we're understanding that it's a lot more complicated. Next. The basic groups, though, we can start with are on the ploidy level, so diploids. You may hear, for the more plant nerds out there, that bananas are triploid and they're seedless because, or they're parthenocarpic because they're seedless sterile triploids. None of that's really true. There's a lot of edible diploids. They tend to be more slender. They often have very upright leaves. And although some are smaller, some can actually be quite large. Next. We have triploids. This is what most common edible varieties tend to be triploids. The plants are usually a little bit more robust, often with more horizontal leaves. Next. And then we have tetraploids, which the plants are often extremely robust, and even the leaves are sometimes so large that they're drooping towards the ground. Beyond tetraploid, the seedlings can be generated, but they're totally inviable, and they typically just either die off quickly or remain like permanent seedlings. Next. So on top of the layer, or I guess classifying them by ploidy level, you also have what's called a subgroup. So the subgroup concept in bananas is that it's a group of cultivars that are all clonal mutants from one original seedling. And the way that that probably happened was that somebody found a cool seedling growing in their garden, say in Papua New Guinea 5,000 years ago, and said, that's nice, I'll keep that. And then after a few years, someone else saw it and said, hey, can I have a keiki of that? Sure, they gave it to them. And then that can keep happening, and then at some point it can mutate in someone's garden. And when it changes, maybe for height, maybe for color, maybe for fruit shape, then if it's stable, that's a new variety. And then someone shares that, and then someone shares that, and so on. So it's really rare for any individual grower to ever see that happen in your field. But if you combine, millions and millions of gardeners and farmers over thousands of years, you end up getting a lot of diversity. So that's how you have different types, like we have dwarf apple and tall apple and the red bananas that sometimes turn back to green. It's not a perfect system. The more we learn, the more we find plants that don't really fit neatly into any of that. But still, cultivars within a subgroup tend to be very similar in many ways, and they just vary, by things like height or light, pigmentation, if they're more red or more green. Next. So some classic subgroups or important ones to note. Mshare. This is actually one of the most interesting and poorly understood groups of edible bananas. They're diploids, which means they just have 2 sets of chromosomes. They have huge bunches with huge fruit and excellent fruit quality. What's weird about them is that they're only known from East Africa, even though at some point they had to have been brought from Southeast Asia, and nobody's been able to find any in Southeast Asia yet. So they're only known from like Tanzania, the Comoros Islands, Mayotte, a little bit in Kenya. But what's the other interesting part about them is that we found out recently that they are one of the ancestral parents to Cavendish, Gros Michel, and Pomme, which is what our apple bananas are. Those are 3 of the most widespread, common, dominant bananas in the world. And this plant is a parent to each of the 3 in different combinations. So it happened someplace in Southeast Asia. We don't know where that happened. But it's a really, really important group of bananas. Next. Okay, that was going back a little bit. Let me try. Okay, in Papua New Guinea, there are so many diploids that every time someone goes, I've been 3 times myself, we always find new things. They used to we believe that they were all documented. I think there was around 500. Each time we've gone now, we find at least another 100 to 200 new varieties. And I think the reason is that they're still domesticating, they're still evolving, they're still crossing. And I kind of have a little super nerdy joke in my head. It's like you could breed a new banana, or you could just go find it in Papua New Guinea. Next. This is just a selection. They come in every sort of size, shape, and permutation you can think of. Next. Some are really short. This is me next to one called Apuka Biang. Naturally, it grows about 3 feet tall, flowers in about 4 months, makes a cute little bunch of fruit. You also have fruit that are, longer than my forearm, and these are both diploids, very closely related. Next. Cavendish, this is a classic triploid group. It varies in height. There's a lot of different varieties because it's so widely grown. Next, please. And I just want to give a little note about Cavendish. I hear a lot of Cavendish slander in my line of work. Cavendish is the #1 banana grown in the world. About 50% of all bananas grown in the world are Cavendish. It's pretty much all the export. And because of that, people think, it's kind of this junk banana, whatever, it's the common one. But in reality, this is an unimproved heirloom land race that was someone's seedling in a backyard in Vietnam thousands of years ago. And it has made it to become the dominant variety of the world's largest fresh fruit export and marketing system. So I always like to say, hey, we shouldn't really talk about what's junk about Cavendish, but what's really amazing about it, because it wasn't picked because it's a junk banana. It's in that position because it's actually a really good banana. It's really productive. It's relatively adaptable, and even despite what people think about how it tastes, a lot of that comes from how it's treated. We could take our local apple bananas here and pick them 3/4 mature, hold them in cold storage for 3 weeks, force ripen them at too low of a temperature so they get yellow enough, and then eat them in Russia, and they're not going to taste good. So it's not the Cavendish's fault. But anyway, I'm a Cavendish. I'll defend it. Okay, next. On to Gros Michel. So this is the variety that was the export dominant cultivar before Cavendish. A lot of people think it was the best banana in the world and it's extinct. Neither of them are probably true, but it is pretty good. And it's not extinct. I grow it on relatively small scale on my farm, but you can still find it relatively commonly in backyards here. In Hawaii, we know it here locally as blue fields. Next. Red, this is another really common triploid subgroup. Everyone wants to know what's the real name of this variety. You hear Cuban red, Jamaican red, Indian red, this red, that red. In every single language in the world that I've come across it, it's always just the local translation of red banana. So I just call it red, and that's what you'll find in the literature. It's just called red. But sometimes it reverts to green, in which case it's called green red, and sometimes there's short forms, which is called dwarf red. And again, I always find it fascinating that when we collect varieties in different countries, like in Papua New Guinea, and we ask them, what's the name? We want to know what this original special name is, and it's always something like this, just in their language. It's like, I don't know, that's the little banana. That's the long banana. That's the red banana. So I just stick with these: red, green red, dwarf red. Next question?
When I came here, everybody thought it was a cooking banana.
Oh, that's a really great introduction. So cooking banana versus dessert banana doesn't really exist. Pretty much all bananas start off starchy when they're unripe. As they ripen, the starch converts to sugar and it gets sweeter and softer. What you decide to do with that banana is mostly up to cultural preference and recipe. There's definitely differences between them, but there is almost no banana that I found, except for one really strange variety in New Guinea that just didn't ripen. It would stay starchy, and it would just rot and dehydrate before it ripened. But even plantains, here we go, perfect segue, can be eaten ripe, raw, and sweet. And if you don't like that and you think they should only be cooked, that's more of a human sociological layer than the banana. I like to say they don't come with instructions. Although when I sell them, sometimes they do give people instructions. But plantains are actually a very specific genetic group. There's often a misunderstanding that there's a difference between bananas and plantains, but that's kind of like saying dogs and chihuahuas. Plantains specifically are a triploid group with 2 genomes from Acuminata and 1 from Balbisiana. There's a lot of varieties of them. They they don't just vary by things like color and height, like most do. They do that as well, but also in inflorescence and bunch morphology. There's three main types: French, which have a full bunch that look like a kind of classic banana with a lot of fruit and a male bud. Then there's false horn types, which have fewer fruit but somewhat larger. And then a degenerating male bud. And then true horns, which usually have only 1 or 2 hands of fruit that are very, very large fruited, and absolutely no male bud. So they just make female flowers, sometimes 1 hand, and then they stop. Next. Bluego, this is a common triploid ABB group. So if we compare it to the plantains, which are AAB versus ABB, they're both triploid, but in the plantains, 2 sets came from Acuminata, 1 from Balbisiana, and in this, 1 from Acuminata and 2 from Balbisiana. I don't know if I said that right, but we get the A's and the B's. We have a few different varieties here in Hawaii, but Largo is the most common one. Next. Okay, now we're going to go talk about a different wild species for a second. So Acuminata and Balbisiana, those were the primary wild ancestors. That just give the A's and the B's. There's this not rare, but relatively disregarded wild species in Papua New Guinea called Musa schizocarpa. That means splitting fruit, because when the fruit is ripe, it will just split right on the bunch. So that's an adaptation for birds or other little mammals to come and eat the fruit right away. Next. It's been known for quite a while that there are Acuminata schizocarpa hybrids in Papua New Guinea. So this creates a whole new category, AS bananas. It used to be thought there were only diploids, but in New Guinea we found a triploid, an AAS cultivar. They tend to have kind of sour flesh and really dark green skin. They're interesting. I don't think they're particularly tasty, but I still love them. Next. But, you know, those were identified in maybe the 80s and 90s. What we're finding actually now with modern genetics is this species that pretty much everyone disregarded has a genetic signature in almost every single edible variety. And the loose hypothesis, which there isn't enough data on it yet, is that they crossed with Banksii, one of the primary Acuminata ancestors, potentially, you know, thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years ago, and integrated in to the point where actually Banksii is part schizocarpa. But it's really not clear. But there's some new research coming out that I've been really fortunate to be part of that basically shows even things like Cavendish and plantains, the old dogma was they come from these 2 species, but actually there's at least this 3rd species in. And I don't know if you can see, but this is basically a fancy way of just showing what are the ancestors of these. And there's actually huge chunks of DNA in almost every single edible banana that we don't know what it comes from. We don't know what the wild plant is. No one's ever studied it. We don't know if we've seen it. And it's just really interesting. And from a breeding perspective, you know, we've only been using Acuminata and Balbisiana to create new edible varieties, and everything else has kind of been disregarded. But this has really inspired me and other breeders to think, wow, you could really actually expand the gene pool and start breeding with all these different weird stuff, because in fact, it's already happened. We just didn't know about it. Next. Okay, we're going to talk, that was everything in U Musa. Now we're going to talk about Kali Musa for a second. So this is like a subgenera of the genus. Most of the wild species are kind of these pretty ornamental, weird little things that you find deep in the forests in places like Borneo. Kali Musa means the beautiful bananas, and you can see a lot of them are kind of beautiful and interesting. Next. There's one species, Musa macleayi, which is native to Papua New Guinea, and it's most likely the wild ancestor to Fe'i bananas. So if anyone is familiar with Fe'i bananas, the fruit bunch goes straight up in the air. The fruit is super high in carotenoids, it's making it like neon yellow nearly, and the sap is often purple or red when you cut through it. So this is wild macleayi. Next.
Is Fe'i the only one that has those things in it that make your mouth all prickly?
Is Fe'i the only one that makes your mouth prickly?
It doesn't make your mouth prickly, but it does turn your urine green.
I kind of agree that it does sometimes make your mouth prickly.
Yeah, definitely.
If it's raw. And it also turns your urine very extreme dark colors. So you're both right.
Is it the only one though?
Yes. as far as I've experienced, and also its wild ancestors, maculae, have that same kind of weird, like, itching your throat thing when they're raw, but if you cook them, they're fine. So yeah, this is fei. So what's interesting about them is they're a group that evolved in parallel with all the other edible varieties in the same way. So selection for parthenocarpy and seedlessness and all this stuff, but they weren't talking to the other bananas. It's almost like dogs came from wolves, and then in another part of the world, dogs came from foxes too, sort of. It's like sort of similar, but totally different. So they're really weirdo, totally out there, and there's a lot of varieties, and they're not well understood. Next. But we've been trying to understand them. There's actually a lot of diversity throughout the Pacific. I was fortunate enough to be a part of an expedition in the Cook Islands. This is on Rarotonga, where if you look at the plants, they look like maybe there's 3 or 4 different varieties, but we collected as much as we can, took it back to the lab and found, wow, they're actually all really unique and different, which indicates that they could still be crossing and making seedlings, and the diversity isn't as apparent, but it's still there. Next. Like I mentioned before, they have this really intensely pigmented sap that's used a lot for dyeing in the Pacific to add color to textiles. Next. You can see here I'm just playing with it with some kappa, and also the pseudostem fibers are often really dark black, and so they're used in weaving to add color to like lauhala weaving, especially in traditionally in like Tahiti and places further in the South Pacific. Next. This is more of the fruit, extremely carotenoid rich and really delicious, unlike any other banana you've likely ever had. Next, please. Okay, one more species, wild species to talk about is Musa itinerans. So this is a little bit like Schizocarpa in that we've known about it. It's nothing special. It's actually one of the most common wild bananas throughout Indochina. There's millions of them. They're not threatened in any way. And they're really commonly eaten as vegetables, like the male buds and the inner pseudostem. The fruit, it's used in those alcohol tinctures, but no one has ever tried thinking about crossing it with edible varieties. They grow right next to the wild ancestors of the edible bananas, but they don't cross in the wild. There has been some experimental crosses, but no one ever got anything from them, so it was disregarded, and that was almost 100 years ago they tried that. Next. But what we found in Laos and Vietnam is I found these varieties on an expedition. I'm like, these are kind of weird. I don't really recognize them, but let's collect them. Turns out they're tri-specific triploid cultivars that were totally new. It's like a new chapter in banana domestication. So these are now called our ABI hybrids because they have a full genome from Acuminata, Balbisiana, and itinerans. Next. The fruit looks kind of standard. Once you start to know what to look at, I could start to kind of see the itinerans' influence in them, but otherwise they kind of look like a typical edible banana. Next. What's interesting though, so these different colored bars represent each of the 3 genomes in the chromosomes. All you really need to know is that the blue and the red are Acuminata and Balbisiana. And because they're not solid bars, that means that they could kind of cross and share genetics a bit. The itinerans is a full brown bar in every single chromosome, which means that it was too different from the other ones. They don't speak the same language, and so they didn't actually combine DNA at all. It just threw the itinerans' DNA on top of everything else. So what's really to think about, like what that means is that these species actually are really, really different, and they're not genetically compatible, and yet we still, or something made these. So it's like, we're talking about breeding different varieties, is really another point of inspiration to me that if you have a plant, this is in banana world, I don't know how it works in avocados or mangoes, but if there's a species that's sort of marginally related, and everyone tells you that you can't cross them, it's worth a try. And actually, if I tried to do this for the rest of my life, I don't have a high faith that I would be able to reproduce it. But yet we've found at least 4 different cultivars that have originated in Southeast Asia on their own. So it's possible. Unlikely, but possible. Next. Okay, so I don't know, I don't expect anybody to follow this level of detail, but we have these two big groups of bananas, the Musa and the Cali Musa, that kind of like the itinerans are really genetically incompatible. By Botany 101 standards, you should not be able to cross them at all. But in Papua New Guinea, there are hybrids of them. Who could have thought that? Here's some examples. Again, they don't really look that unique, but they are actually extremely unlikely crosses that have existed. Next. The fruit of these, they're basically like taking, say, an apple banana and crossing it with a fei. They have relatively high carotenoid levels, but fruit that looks more like a typical banana. And again, these plants shouldn't exist, but they do. Next. What we've also found in Papua New Guinea, so I was mentioning before about there's diploids, triploids, and tetraploids. Tetraploid bananas means they have 4 sets of chromosomes. Classically, those were only known from banana breeding programs. So if you go out into the villages of the world and find all the traditional varieties, they would only be diploid or triploid, and tetraploids were thought to only be something that was man-made. In Papua New Guinea, like I said, you could breed a new banana or you could go to New Guinea and find it. We've actually found at least 4 different naturally occurring tetraploids that are also all directly relatable to common known triploid groups. So we have Kalapua-like tetraploids, we have Pisangawak, that's called Namo, also locally tetraploids, and even silk-like tetraploids. The fruit kind of tastes like them, the plants kind of look like them, except they're all exaggerated. They're much bigger, the fruit's bigger, the bunches are bigger, the leaves are bigger. Next. And what we found, even more interesting, is that they are also intersectional hybrids. So not only are they tetraploids, so they have more DNA than you would expect, but that DNA is coming from actually the Cali Musa species. And so basically all these colors here are different species that have contributed. So some of these edible varieties have up to 6 different wild species in their genetic makeup. And at least 3 of them shouldn't be able to coexist. So it's just, again, it's an inspiration for the breeding of, try it, it might work. It happened in New Guinea, which a lot of weird stuff happens in New Guinea. But
it stays there.
Well, I'm trying to get some of these here. I'll check back, I don't have them yet. Next, please. All right, so now we're gonna talk a little bit about the mechanics of banana breeding. Wild bananas are full of seed. They're in fact so full of seed that there isn't often enough pulp for them to even rot. These are wild bananas that they just sort of like dehydrate and become the seed if you leave them to their own devices. Next. So there's the female stage and the male stage. The female stage on the left, this is a species Musa lutea, which I thought was just a nice pretty example to show this. They'll open up early in the morning, and that's when you would hand pollinate. So if I were breeding, I'd collect from a different plant at the male stage, collect the male flowers, and then pollinate the female flowers. Next. I have a little notebook where I log everything. I go out and I collect my flowers, and it's really dead simple. You just put the male flowers on the female flowers, and the pollen goes there. Sometimes there's not very much pollen, and so in that case, I can take a toothpick and actually manually open up the anthers, get a little bit of that, and put it on. But it's really super simple. You just get pollen, make a cross, get seed. Next. Oh, there's some close-up of the pollen on the male flowers. Next. And the female flowers opening. I'll often use a banana bract as my male flower collector holder, so I don't have to worry about leaving it in the field. I just throw it away when I'm done. But that's the perfect time to be pollinating. And what's also nice about banana breeding is that each hand or cluster of bananas on the bunch opens about 1 per day. And so I can pollinate an entire hand, anywhere from 14 to 30 fruits sometimes. And that can be 1 cross, and then I label it, and then the next day I can use the same female parent but make another cross that's really different and distinct. So I can label like hand 1 is this parent, hand 2 is this parent, hand 3 is this parent. So on 1 bunch of bananas, if there's 10 hands, I can make 10 different crosses on the same bunch and have it all really easy to find and really easy to organize. I'll take my these nursery tags with a hole in them and a little string. I tie them around the top of the bunch, and I say what cross is on what hand. And when I harvest them, I'll just take that tag, put it in the pot, and then that's the population. So I don't lose track of my, what's what. Next. It's really important to bag the flowers to prevent pollinations that you don't want to occur. Usually I'll use mesh bags, which are just, like a paint strainer kind of thing. But in a pinch, I'll also just take, if I don't have any, or they're broken, or I find a cross that I want to make and I don't want to run back to get my stuff, I'll just take a bract and wrap it around the flowers and then tie it with the pseudostem fibers to create a quick barrier, because they're only receptive for about 1 or 2 days. So as long as it stays on there for that amount of time, then I'm good. So that's sort of a quick infield way for pollination isolation. Next. All right, so going back again to a little bit of the mechanics, parthenocarpic and domesticated edible bananas. Bananas are not seedless inherently. Seedlessness is actually a condition. It's not a trait. So just because a banana doesn't have seeds doesn't mean it can't have seeds, and that's kind of the secret of banana breeding. This variety here is a normal edible variety that almost would never have seeds. But if you pollinate it and you get seeds, you might get a few and they look like that. Those little black specks that you always see in banana, some people think those are the seeds. They're just the unfertilized ovules that never develop. So those aren't the seeds. The true seeds are usually about the size of a peppercorn. They're pretty hard. And if you had seeds in the fruit, then it kind of ruins them for eating. So that's one of the central challenges in banana breeding, is using seeds to generate new plants of fruit that you don't want to have seeds. It's very conflicting. Next. This is another example. So again, seedlessness, not a condition, or sorry, it's a condition, not a trait. So to see what that looks like, on the left we have a parthenocarpic domesticated edible variety. So whether or not it's pollinated, it'll just make the fruit and there'll be pulp. On the far right is a wild type. It's not parthenocarpic and it wasn't pollinated, so there's no seed. So that's a seedless variety, or it's in a seedless state, let's say. But if you pollinate it, which is the middle one, you'll actually get seed growth. You can see those little baby bumps on the fruit. That's where the seed's growing. So that's a non-parthenocarpic variety that had seed growth. So even though you don't have a banana that ever has seeds in it, there's still a chance that if you force pollinate it with the right parent, that you can force seed set in it. Next. All right, there we go. So collecting seed at the right time is very important. If anybody's ever tried to buy banana seeds online of wild species just for fun, you've probably found that even if they were banana seeds, which often they're not, that the germination was 0. There's a lot of unknown factors in banana seed dormancy and storage, but what I found is that if you're collecting seed for actually trying to grow, the fruit needs to start to ripen on the plant. You can't harvest it a little immature. For edible varieties, you can harvest them immature and they'll ripen just fine if you want to eat the fruit, but if you need the mature seed, the fruit needs to start to ripen. So what I'll do is I'll collect the bunches when they're have some ripe fruit, when they're yellow like that, and then I'll even wait till they get a little bit overripe and rotting and soft, and then I just put the pulp in a strainer. Next. You can see it's just a bunch of rotting banana with some black specks in it. Next. I take a hose and I just blast all the fruit pulp through the strainer and I'm left with the seeds. Pretty simple. Next. I'll take those seeds and I'll put them in communal pots in the nursery. I take that breeding tag from the field that I put on and I just put it straight in the pot. And I find if they're fresh seeds, they tend to germinate in about 2 weeks to 2 months. And after that, I don't throw them away. I'll leave the pots usually for about a year or two, just in case. Sometimes after about 2 years, you can still get germination, but at some point I do throw them out. And it's usually really sporadic. Like I said, banana seed germination is not well understood. The plants have never been domesticated for seed germination, so they act, even the edible bananas, the seed acts like a wild banana. in the sense that the germination is under mysterious forces. You know, if you take a tomato and you plant the seeds, they just grow. That's because it's been selected to do that. You know, original wild tomatoes may not have. I don't know, I'm not a tomato scientist. But in banana world, wild banana germination is all over the place, and so the edible ones are still kind of all over the place. Next. Once they start putting out some true leaves, I'll separate them into individual pots. If they make it to that stage, they usually get a new identification where I can keep track of each one and then plant it in the field. Next. This is just an example of some of the hybrids that I've made. I don't really have a lot to say about the hybrids that I've made so far, not because I'm trying to withhold information, but because I'm just looking for something really good. And I don't want to like put junk out there yet. But I'm getting a lot of interesting colors, some different growth habits. And like I mentioned before, seeds are a necessary problem. So in my personal breeding program, without a lot of technology, I'm trying to ride the line between having plants that I can breed with, so I'm encouraging fertility, but also still trying to create fruits that are enjoyable to eat, which means that they don't have seeds. So because seeds are necessary to the advancement of the varieties, I'm trying to keep some fertility, which also I think is interesting because if I do ever, I don't say if, when I release varieties, I'd like them to be something that people theoretically could continue to improve on. Like I don't want it to, end with me. If I release a bunch of varieties, when I'm done with that, I want those varieties to still be able to evolve and move forward. Next. Because I'm using some different interesting wild species that aren't typically used in edible varieties as inspiration from what I've seen out in the world, I'm also getting a lot of weird colors and different fruit shapes and forms. A lot of these I wasn't intending to breed them, but they look really cool, and some of my florist friends are taking interest in them, and so I've started sort of selecting also specifically for cut flower ornamentals. The fruit quality at that point is meaningless, so it's a lot easier to hit that mark. All it has to do is look cool. So I'm definitely creating some cool looking varieties. Next. This is actually one that I was breeding to be an edible variety, and it actually is technically edible. It is slightly parthenocarpic. It makes some pulp, but it also looks really pretty, and this might be one of the first ones that I actually start selling the plants of, but still doesn't have a name yet. Next. Back to Cali Musa for a section. So those ones, I have tried breeding them with Fe'i, which is the edible Cali Musas. Haven't got any luck with that yet, but I'm proud to say at least I tried. But I have been able to create some interspecific wild hybrids for different new cut flower use, specifically using coccinia, which is known to have persistent bracts, kind of like a heliconia or a ginger, so they don't fall off like typical bananas. And so in crossing them, I'm trying to create new ornamental cut flower bananas that don't shed as much, but kind of have new colors and new textures and new growth forms. Next. All right, so the key points that all of you future banana breeders out there need to keep in mind is that ploidy can vary from diploid, triploid, or tetraploid. Parthenocarpy is essential, but sterility is nice. It's not essential. You don't need sterility, and in fact, like I mentioned, true sterility doesn't really exist. If you cross enough and you have the right parents, you can still get seed. Seedlessness is a condition, not a trait. Sterility helps to prevent seed formation, but it makes breeding really difficult. So this is one of the reasons actually why, going back to Cavendish, it's still the dominant banana, is because despite all the modern technology and effort of banana breeding, no one's been able to breed anything that has been better, meeting all the standards. Improving landrace cultivars is really difficult. I didn't get too into it right now, but going back to all those different wild, the ancestors, like the Machare, there's the ancestor to Cavendish and Gros Michel. New breeding approaches, instead of trying to improve the varieties we have, it's actually improve their ancestors and then recreate them in a superior form. I didn't get into that now, but that's one of the newer techniques. Seed handling is really challenging. There's a lot we don't know about it, but basically cross anything with anything else and it may work. So don't let a textbook tell you you can't do it, but listen to it because they have a lot of good advice in there. But then keep pushing the boundaries and you never know what you'll produce. Next. Hey, look, that's it. Hopefully you guys learned something, and if you have any questions or want to geek out more on bananas, feel free to go to our Instagram or our website, and I will take any questions now. Yes? The best fertilizer for bananas? Depends on what you're missing in your soil. Yeah, but they're pretty heavy feeders that will take almost anything you throw at them. Maybe focus on the potassium. Anthony in back.
Yeah, I have a hand of silk fake bananas on the table that were given to me by a farmer. He said, "Here, take these to the thing." For some reason, I'm getting like a firm, like hard center in the bananas.
Yeah.
What causes that?
Silk is particularly prone to that, I've noticed. Also sometimes like hard little weird spots. It's a little bit hard to pinpoint why, but I've noticed that they tend to develop that way if there's like a little bit cooler temperatures. But I haven't pinpointed that. But silk is a little finicky in that way. Wow, so many questions. Over here. Yeah. Plantains and reds, if you guys want to grow them, I can give you some advice. Thank you for that. Yeah, question. Okay. Oh, good question. So what are the goals of my breeding program and the challenges? I have a few different goals. One is to investigate bunchy top resistance, not so much in trying to create a bunchy top resistant variety that's going to like be commercially viable, because that's really difficult, but just to kind of see how far I can get, maybe get funding or pass it off to someone else. I'm also breeding for short flowering cycles and like short plants, so kind of redistributing the harvest throughout the year on one plant. Cut flowers, and then also just purely experimental, like to learn more about banana diversity through breeding. So I'll make crosses just because I'm curious and I want to learn about it. As for the challenges, probably the biggest challenge is that you don't really have any income off the plants. So you're growing all these plants in the field, putting a lot of work in towards them, and just for a hope that maybe one day they can, but it's hard to manage like field space and time and resources to put into this crop that is just as a hope. So, but the actual creating new varieties isn't so difficult.
So the resistance to the bunchy top, is there any modern varieties or information there resistant?
Yeah, so bunchy top resistance is actually what I did my master's thesis on. The classic dogmas, there's nothing that's resistant to bunchy top, but when I went and looked at the literature, I found that there really wasn't enough sampling done to make that statement. And actually I found a specimen of Acuminata subspecies malacensis, which you all remember is one of the primary ancestral subspecies for the domesticated varieties. And it was growing at Lion Arboretum on Oahu in the back of Manoa Valley. The staff there were like, yeah, there's some like banana, doesn't make fruit, we just try to get rid of it. I'm like, that's interesting. I went and collected it. Oh, it's malacensis. There's malacensis growing nowhere else in the state. And was probably introduced during the founding of Lion when Harold Lion was sent around the world to collect all kinds of weird stuff and basically find the most invasive, difficult to get rid of, obnoxious things you can to stabilize the soil in the back of Manoa Valley. That must have been brought in. I collected it, whatever. I put in my trial, could not give it bunchy top. And I've still never been able to give it bunchy top. And so a lot of my bunchy top experimental hybrids have that in it. And it's really hard to show if something's bunchy top resistant because you have to fairly challenge it. And it can be that to do that properly, I did it as a master's student, so I know what's involved. Now as a farmer, I'm like, I don't have time for that. So I just put my plants out there, and if they're really good, I keep them, and I'll just see how long they last. And maybe one day if I have something that's good in every other trait, I can also check for bunchy top resistance. Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, so for the growers, if you're looking to start growing some bananas, what kind of advice would you have for somebody who's growing their bananas, sourcing your banana, and maintaining your banana?
Advice for banana growers, man. Probably the number one thing is, the source. If you're getting new plants in, the source of them, making sure that they're clean. Cleaning means free of bunchy top virus, also nematodes, corm weevils. So you got to start with good, healthy stock. But probably actually kind of in tandem with that is just that bananas are really hard to keep clean. And throughout the Pacific, and actually much of the world, but especially in the Pacific, we're in the Pacific, right? Bananas traditionally are grown in rotational gardens with root crops. They're never, going back to the wild plants, they're pioneer species. So if a tree falls in the forest or there's a landslide or a fire and the dense canopy of the forest opens up, wild bananas are typically one of the first things to germinate. And they'll grow for maybe 2, 3, 4 years. And as the forest recovers and the trees start to grow up again and more shade is happening, they've produced their seed and moved on, and the bananas will start to die out. The edible bananas come straight from those wild ones. So I like to think of it as that they were never meant to be long-term plants. And the fact that you could grow bananas in Hawaii, you just plant them and leave them and they have bananas forever, that's just sort of an artifact of being in a really isolated place. But everywhere else in the world, all the pests and diseases are already got there, and people have figured out for a long time that you got to keep bananas moving. So you can't plant them like they're trees where you just plant them and expect them to go forever. I know some of you out there will be, I planted them in there forever. Good for you, blessings. I love that for you. That's not the case for me or for most people. So, you kind of got to grow them more like a longer term vegetable and just keep them moving. So always have a new plot that you're planning on putting in and be planning to take out your old stuff. Always have an exit strategy is my advice. Yeah.
So, among all these different species, any of them shown promise with Panama disease race 4?
The question is, for the different species, are any of them resistant to Panama disease race 4, which is a strain of Fusarium? Yes, lots of them. The Malacensis, there's a lot that are resistant in that group. And actually breeding for Fusarium or Panama wilt resistance has been really easy in the banana world, to create new varieties that are resistant. The challenge is always creating new varieties that are resistant and productive and tasty and fit the carton and have the right shipping temperature, because they're all trying to compete with Cavendish, which the whole system is designed around. But if you're just trying to create new varieties, especially for local markets, there's a lot that's been released from breeding programs that's totally good for that. Any other questions about banana breeding or cultivation? Yeah, in the back.
Have you looked at antioxidant properties or other nutritional qualities?
Have I looked at antioxidant or other nutritional qualities? No, I haven't. Sorry. Yeah, question?
So can you pollinate fruit like a namwa with an apple banana flower and get seeds out of that? Could any of us do that?
So the trick about banana breeding that I didn't touch on all of it because we could be here for the whole weekend talking about banana breeding, is that the actual cross you make is really important. So for example, namwa doesn't have pollen. So it's male sterile, but it's actually really female fertile. Apple, if you use the dwarf apple, it also doesn't have, its male flowers rot before they even are exposed. The tall one, you may be able to, under certain conditions, if you look hard enough, find a little bit of pollen and scrape it out and put it on the namwa, but probably not, but it's possible. You'd have to just really, really scour for the pollen. So yeah, those two crosses, those two plants, probably not, but each of those, if you took a wild banana that had a lot of pollen, or an edible diploid that had more fertility and a lot of pollen, and pollinated them, you very likely will get seed. And you could plant that seed and probably not make a good banana, but you never know. You only need one good plant.
Is there a common cultivar that has more pollen?
Common cultivars that have more pollen, I would say nothing common, but they're out there. If you wanted to go with like a wild one, just to experiment, like the Balbiciana or their Sphaeral acuminata, you can use that. Rose, it's a pretty obscure variety, but if you've come across it, it's around. It has a lot of pollen and can be used. Or like Goldfinger, which is one of the tetraploids, it has pollen. You could try to use that. Going back to the gentleman's first question, I said no, I haven't. I haven't investigated the nutritional stuff myself, but the biggest difference usually between bananas nutritionally is carotenoids. So like the fei that are really orange, super deep in carotenoids, that's like one of the main things that have actually been studied and bred for. But I haven't done any of that work. I'm just kind of on the farming end.
Okay, question. You know, in terms of the Hawaiian varieties of bananas, what do you have any comments on that? What do you say about the Hawaiian varieties?
The Hawaiian varieties, so yeah, there's the kind of main types are the Maoli Popu'ulu and Iholena. They're really good culinarily. They're challenged, like the reason they're rare, and actually this applies also to like the true plantains and the reds. The reason they're rare is because they're kind of hard to grow. Like if they were super vigorous and really abundant and really easy, we'd see more of them. But you know, rare stuff is often rare for a reason. For the Hawaiian varieties, they're susceptible to almost every single pest and disease to an extreme degree. With the Iholenas, you can kind of get by, and also some of the Popu'ulu, like Huamoa, they fruit really quickly. So as long as you really lean into that concept of growing them like a vegetable, or growing them like kalo, like plant, harvest, replant, harvest, replant, harvest, replant, you can kind of stay ahead of the pests, but you can't avoid them. And so it's a numbers game at that point. But honestly, once you solve that, I would say I've kind of solved that. I've created a system that I could grow like a lot of Iholena. My next barrier was the marketing. Like the Hawaiian varieties of banana, the Maya, they check every box that I feel like generally the right kind of people want, but they're just so rare that it's not even on the radar. So I've found that if I actually grow them, it's harder to move them in quantity. That makes it worthwhile to grow. So we're kind of going back to the drawing board and figuring out like how can we market them differently, how can we process them differently, how can we kind of put them out there and make people demand them, because every time I've grown a lot of them, I'm just sitting on them and usually send them to a baby food processor to just get mixed with everything else, which is kind of sad. But at least I'm keeping the plants going. Yeah. Yeah, so banana skins, I mean, I've seen some recipes and had them like just cooking them, and they're not toxic. Certain varieties can be soft enough that you can eat them. I mean, it's probably really high fiber, but yeah, I've had some sort of like pulled pork imitation dishes with them. And then yeah, as for fuzzy bananas, totally. The pink one at the beginning of my slide, Mr. Velutina, it's naturalized in some areas here. It is fuzzy. Velutina. Yeah, it's kind of like velvet. Akaka Falls. Yeah, just go for a hike there and you'll see them, and they're wild and they actually self-pollinate. So every plant, if it flowers, will make seeded fruit, because the flowers actually, they don't have female and male. They have hermaphrodite and male flowers. So the fruit always self-pollinates, and if you take some seed, you're clearing out invasive species. So you shouldn't have a problem with it. Yeah, they're invasive, so I give you permission. I don't know about anyone else, but yeah.
You're in the center of the photo, the Pitogo.
That is Pitogo. Good eye.
That's the best one for if you're after one is apple flavor.
It tastes really good. That's Pitogo in the center. It's a variety from the Philippines. It's about the size and shape of a golf ball. Really cool, really fun, looks great in photos. My problem with it is a large bunch of them is about 10 pounds of fruit. That's like massive.
Yeah, but for home gardens, you're not overwhelmed. And you don't have to peel them. You just pull them off when they're ripe and then pop them in your mouth.
Yeah, they're fun. I'm an equal banana opportunist, so I'm not going to trash talk it too much, but it has its place. I think it's just like, if you squeeze it, it just kind of like pops out, yeah. Any other banana questions?
Thank you.
Oh, one more in the back, Debbie.
How do you
Oh, that's a good question. So a clump of bananas, different varieties will have different suckering habits. Everything from namwa, which you plant and it just immediately starts throwing tons of keiki out, that's called uninhibited suckering, to something like mshare, which I grow, which has very inhibited, or even the populu and the mauli, very inhibited. Like sometimes they don't even make much keiki until after they fruit the first time. What I've found as a sort of a mantra is if you want to keep it thin, you should prune early and often. So aim for removing keiki when they're about, you just barely see them. If you can get them in the first couple inches after they poke out of the soil. And also don't try to remove them so that you can transplant them if you just want to prune. If you want to prune to keep the mat small, do it at that stage where they're really small and you can just shave them off. It takes like a couple seconds with the right tool just to sever that connection. I've also found that kind of like any plant, this shouldn't surprise a bunch of horticulturalists here, but they do have a degree of apical dominance that you can sort of set up if you do that pruning. So especially in a variety like namwa, which I was talking with someone earlier that's like, wow, they're so insanely vigorous that it's overwhelming. I wish I never planted them. I get you. Can't totally fix that, but if you do like say 2 rounds of pruning before the first fruiting, that main shoot will kind of establish some degree of apical dominance, and then you can, it's not as extreme. Like it kind of sets up the mat in a way that you don't have as much vigorous suckering. And then after that, I'll just do it after each fruiting cycle so I don't disturb the roots and the corms too much. If you have a big old crazy mat that you want to thin back, my advice is actually just to replant, because if you go and try to thin out a big old mat, you really disrupt the architecture of everything, and it just sort of like will fall over and be crazy. And you're better off having just taken out a keiki, replanted it somewhere, and then method of your choice of destruction of the old one, do that to it, and then just keep them moving. And then on the new one, you start your cycle of thinning. There are some techniques that if you cut them at ground level, you can either gouge out the growing point or pour some type of chemical in there. It's useful, but it still will just only kill that shoot. But then usually that keiki corm underneath will just throw out even more. So it's sort of a temporary stopgap, but doesn't really fully eliminate the growth of it. How to eliminate the growth is just like shave them off, like separate off the growth point. So I usually use like a chisel tip bar and just jam it right between in the connection between the mother shoot and the keiki. When they're really small, like they come out, if you could get it when they're 1 inch out of the soil, perfect timing, and just eliminate it, and it'll be done. Yeah, peepers is another term. Nat?
What's your favorite tool for removing entire mats?
Favorite tool for removing entire mats is like a tractor with forks on the front or a backhoe.
Smaller than that you can fit in someone's backyard.
Everyone wants to know what's the magic thing that you can just spray on a plant to kill it that isn't herbicide. It's herbicide. Like you can you can inject with glyphosate, like 20%. There's CTAR publications on it. You use a really small amount. You leave all the leaves on. You make a hole in the pseudostem. You put about 2 tablespoons in. It'll kill it. What's the other way? It's like either you dig it out or you do that. Smothering doesn't work. I guess you could pour salt on it. You don't want to do that. You ruin that spot forever.
But I meant like physical tool for removing the mat.
Yeah, it's kind of whatever you. I don't usually do. It sucks no matter how you do it. I don't really have there isn't like a magic tool. I would say the technique though is that I always would start with the small keiki around the edge, and then just kind of try to cut up the corm chunks from there. But yeah, it sucks, and there's no easy way around it. But any
I use my sawzall.
Your what?
Reciprocating saw.
to cut it up, but then how do you?
I'll stick it right here.
Oh. Hey, maybe sawzall. Depending on how rocky your soil is, that may be awesome, or
Yes.
Dangerous.
I need rocks.
Also, watch out for buried cables and lines. Okay, yeah.
Advice on if you want to take techniques to grow your.
Advice to take keiki? Sure. So first thing is learn how to identify bunchy top. That's a different lecture. Maybe next year. Sorry, guys. And if there's any bunchy top symptoms anywhere on the mat, the whole mat, even if there's keiki that don't show symptoms, don't take anything from that mat. Get a nice thick corm that's going to survive transplant well. Wash off all the soil. Pare the outside like you're peeling a potato. Inspect for corm weevils, which will make little rotten tunnels throughout the keiki shoot. And then it's kind of optional, but good practice is to do either a bleach or hot water treatment. There's guidelines for this online. And then you're safe as you can be. I find that it doesn't really matter the size that you do. Really small is fine. Usually you just would want to pot it up in the nursery first. Larger is more work. It's more it's more to transport if you're moving a lot of them. But they can survive longer before they're planted, so there's pros and cons to that. But you don't want something too big if you're being serious about it, because the further along it is into its growth phase, the more you are disrupting it before its first flowering. So if you take it when they're too large, you can actually really disrupt the first bunch. The second bunches will be fine. So I prefer something in sort of the maybe 1 to 4 foot range. In the back there, question?
Yeah, did you start as a genetic researcher and get drawn to bananas as a fascinating subject, or did you start as a banana farmer and then got interested in breeding?
Why I started them? Yeah, I was 13 and I was just a sassy nerd that was curious and wanted to prove someone wrong about whether a banana was a tree or not. And then I went and looked it up and I never stopped.
So you started with
And that was 25-ish years ago. All right, maybe one more, and then we got to get at that fruit, guys. I'll be around. Yeah.
What was the question?
Basically, is it better to have a smaller mat with fewer shoots, or as many as you want? All things being equal, if water, fertility, sunlight, everything is fine, then you'll basically, the more shoots you have, you'll have more bunches, but smaller bunches. So for a backyard grower, casual, whatever, there's some reasons why you might not want it to get massive, but it'll spread out your harvest a bit. For even semi-serious market growing, it's a lot more efficient to have fewer but larger bunches, because just the effort it takes to swing that machete and get the bunch and transport is pretty much the same no matter what size bunch you have, so you want bigger bunches. All right, I'm going to cut off the questions there for right here, but I'll be around, so please feel free to come up and ask me questions. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful conference.
Thank you, Banana Gabe.